The night the thermometer broke past 38 below, Sigrid Aberg stood alone on her own front porch and listened to the world go silent. It was the kind of silence that came only in the deepest winters, the kind that pressed against the ears the way deep water pressed against a swimmer who had gone too far down. There was no wind. There was no movement of any animal. There was only the slow groan of the river ice a quarter-mile to the west, and now and then from the woodlot the sharp crack of a birch trunk splitting open along its frozen grain. A sound like a rifle shot in the timber, a sound that meant the cold had reached into the heartwood of the trees themselves and was breaking them apart from the inside. She was 64 years old that January night in 1931. She wore 3 wool layers under her father's old wool overcoat, which had come with him from Telemark in 1862, and had survived 69 Minnesota winters and counting. Her hair, gone fully silver 8 years before, was pinned tight under a knit cap. Her hands inside 2 pairs of mittens still hurt from the cold. Her breath came out in front of her face and crystallized at once, hanging in the lamplight like a slow scatter of ground glass. She held the kerosene lantern out in front of her body and looked across the yard toward the woodshed. 30 feet away, low and unremarkable, with its cedar-shake roof banked under a foot of crusted snow, and its open south face stacked 4 cords deep with split birch, the shed sat exactly as it had sat for 11 years. Magnus had built it in their second summer on the property. He had cut the cedar shakes himself with a froe and a mallet on the back porch. And she still remembered the rhythm of those evenings, the steady tap and split, the smell of fresh cedar in the August heat. He had been dead 19 months that night. She lifted the lantern higher and let its small yellow light fall across the snow that covered the shed's north corner. Nothing moved. Nothing showed. The structure looked like every other woodshed in every other yard for 200 miles in any direction. Only she knew what was beneath it. Only she knew that 9 feet down, under packed earth and stone and hay and waxed canvas and the careful labor of 11 September days, the temperature was holding steady at 41 degrees above zero, 80 degrees warmer than the air now pressing against her face. Holding that warmth not by any miracle and not by any fire, and not by any device that could fail in the night. Holding it because the ground itself, deep enough below the surface, still remembered the summer just past. That was what her father had taught her 55 years ago in another country, and another season when she was a child of 9, and he was a man in his prime with a palm pressed flat against a cold stone wall. She turned back toward the house. She did not know yet that the cold pressing down on her property that night would hold for 9 consecutive days. She did not know that before the ridge of Arctic air finally lifted, livestock would die in 3 counties, that 2 old men in the next township would be found frozen in their own dooryards, that the Ranquist farm to the north would lose 2/3 of its stored vegetables, and that a family she had not yet met would owe their lives to the fact that one stubborn Norwegian widow had spent the autumn of 1929 digging a hole no one had asked her to dig. She knew only that the cold was here, that she had prepared, that whatever happened in the days ahead, she was not going to lose what she had lost in 1927. She would not be reduced again. She blew out the lantern, and she went inside and she shut the door behind her against the silence and the cold. The memory came to her that night, the way the strongest memories always came unbidden, with the full sensory weight of the original moment. She was lying on the narrow iron bed in the back room of the house, 3 quilts piled over her, the small box stove down the hall still ticking as it cooled, and she was 9 years old again, and she was in Wisconsin. It was October of 1875. Her father, Torvald Aberg, had brought her down into the root cellar. He had finished the previous summer, behind the smokehouse on their farm outside of Stoughton. The cellar was cut into the side of a low limestone ridge 8 feet deep at its deepest point, lined with quarried stone he had hauled in by sledge through the previous winter. The stone steps were broad and uneven, worn at the edges where his own boots had passed up and down for a year and a half. The lamp he carried was a hurricane lamp with a brass base and a cracked glass chimney that he had repaired with shellac and patience. She remembered the smell first, always the smell. Cold stone and packed earth and the faint, sweet rot of last year's apples that had not quite kept. Below that, woven through it like a thread through cloth, the smell of paraffin from the wax-sealed crocks and the iron tang of the cellar walls themselves. She remembered the warmth. That was the part that had never made sense to her, until much later. The air outside that October afternoon had been cold enough to redden her cheeks during the walk from the house. But 12 steps down into the earth, she had felt the warmth rising to meet her face like the breath off a banked fire. Not heat, not anything like heat. Just the absence of cold, a held breath of summer that the ground itself had not yet released. Her father had crouched beside her at the bottom of the steps. He set the lantern on a flat stone. He took off his cap and put it on her head where it sat down over her eyes, and they had both laughed. Then he had grown serious in the way he sometimes grew serious without warning, and he had put his palm flat against the limestone wall of the cellar. She remembered the spread of his fingers, 5 points pressed against the stone. He had held that pose for a long time without speaking, and she had understood even at 9 years old that he was listening to something she could not yet hear. When he had spoken, his voice had been quieter than the lamplight. The earth keeps summer longer than we do Sigrid, months longer. It cools slow, so slow you can borrow it. That's all this is, borrowing what the ground already has. She had looked at his hand against the wall. She had not understood then. She had filed it away the way a child files a thing that seems important without knowing why, and she had carried it with her for 55 years. She had carried it through her marriage to Magnus Aberg in 1888, when she was 21 and he was 23, and they had stood together in the little Lutheran church in Stoughton, with her father weeping quietly in the front pew. She had carried it through the 11 years they had spent saving for land of their own, and through the spring of 1900, when they had loaded a wagon and crossed into Minnesota and bought 80 acres along a tributary of the Crow Wing River for $15 an acre. She had carried it through 3 decades of building, of clearing, of haying and timber cutting, and the slow accumulation of a life on hard ground. She had carried it through her father's death in 1925, an old man of 85 who had come north to see her one last time and had held her hand at the train station in Brainerd and had said something to her she had not understood at the time. She had carried it through Magnus's death 4 years later, sudden and stupid and unjust, a ruptured appendix in July of 1929, and 4 days of fevered decline before the doctor from Brainerd arrived too late to do anything but write the death certificate. She had carried it through the empty months that followed when the house had felt twice its size, and she had begun, without admitting it to herself, to talk aloud to Magnus while she did the chores. And now, in the deep silence of January 1931, alone in the back bedroom of a house her husband would never enter again, she carried it still, her father's palm against the stone. The earth keeps summer longer than we do. She closed her eyes against the cold and let herself be 9 years old. Just for a moment, just long enough to remember the smell of the wax crocks and the brass of the lantern and the weight of the cap on her head. Then she slept. The September after Magnus died, she began to dig. She did not announce it. She did not write to her cousin in Stoughton, who would have urged her to come back to Wisconsin. She did not mention it to the Lutheran women who came once with a casserole and stood in her kitchen, with the careful pity of those who do not know what to say. She did not even speak of it to herself in any complete sentence. She simply walked out behind the woodshed one morning in the second week of September and looked at the ground. The shed stood where Magnus had placed it in the northeast corner of the property, its back wall set against a low ridge of land that broke the prevailing northwest wind, 18 feet wide, 12 feet deep, open on the south face, where the wood was loaded and pulled. The cedar shake roof he had cut by hand still held its shape after 11 seasons. The floor inside was packed earth, swept clean every spring dry as old bone. She stood inside it that morning and she took off her work glove and she pressed her palm flat against the back wall of the shed, where it rested against the ridge. She held it there for a long time. She was 62 years old. Her knees had begun to ache in damp weather. Her shoulders, which had carried 62 years of work, were no longer young. She did not know if her body could do what she was going to ask it to do. She was going to ask it anyway. She walked back to the house and she sat down at the kitchen table and she wrote in careful pencil on the back of an old seed catalog a list of every measurement and every material she would need. She had not yet told herself the reason, not in words. The reason came later on the third night of digging when she lay down in the dark with her shoulders burning and her hands locked into half fists from the long hours on the spade handle, and she let herself remember the winter of 1927. It had been their 27th year on the property. Magnus had been alive then and well, and the two of them had stocked the old root cellar dug into the hillside behind the house with what they had thought was enough. 140 pounds of potatoes, 60 pounds of turnips, 3 crocks of pickled cabbage, a cedar box of cornmeal, the usual. The old cellar had been Magnus's first project on the land. 14 feet long, 8 feet wide. Walls of stacked fieldstone roofed with rough lumber under 2 feet of banked earth. In a normal winter, it held between 38 and 42 degrees, which was cold enough to keep root vegetables and jarred stores from spoiling, but only barely. In the third week of January 1927, a cold snap had come down out of Manitoba and stayed. 19 days. 3 weeks of unbroken cold that drove the temperature inside that root cellar down to 22 degrees and held it there. By the time the cold broke, she had lost almost everything. The potatoes had frozen and turned black at the cores. The turnips had split open. The pickled cabbage had separated and ruined. The dried apples stacked in cheesecloth had survived, and the cornmeal in the cedar box had survived. And that was all. She and Magnus had sat at the kitchen table in early February 1927, and they had counted what was left, and they had been quiet for a long time. Then Magnus had said, in the careful voice he used when he was trying to spare her something, that he was going to ride over to the Skoglund place that afternoon. Sigrid had understood at once. The Skoglunds 3 miles east were old country Norwegian like themselves, prosperous in the small, careful way of farmers who had been on their land long enough to ride out a single bad year. Halvor Skoglund and his wife Anna had 3 nearly grown sons and a deep root cellar of their own, and they would not let a neighbor go hungry. Magnus had ridden over that afternoon. He had come back at sundown in the wagon with 100 weight of potatoes, a sack of carrots, 2 crocks of preserves, and a small smoked ham that Anna Skoglund had wrapped in brown paper. Sigrid had stood in the dooryard while Magnus unloaded the wagon. She had not gone out to help him. She had stood inside the doorway with her hand pressed against the frame, and she had watched him carry the charity into her house, and she had felt something inside her contract into a small, hard place she had not known was there. It was not that the Skoglunds were unkind. They were kind. They were exactly as kind as her own father would have wanted them to be. It was that she, Sigrid Aberg, daughter of Torvald, who had built the limestone cellar in Wisconsin, granddaughter of farmers who had wrested a living from the high, stony ground above the Telemark fjords for 200 years, had stood in her own doorway in her own country and watched another woman's preserves come into her house because her own had been lost. She had thanked Anna Skoglund. She had eaten the food. She had done what was needed. But she had not forgotten. And lying in her bed on the third night of digging in September 1929, with her hands stiff and her shoulders burning, she finally let herself say in the quiet of her own mind the sentence she had been refusing to say for 2 years. I will never accept charity again. Not because charity was wrong. Charity was not wrong. Charity was in its way the closest thing to grace that fallen people could offer one another. But she would not be reduced again, not while she still had a back that could lift and hands that could hold a spade, and a memory of her father's palm against a stone wall in Wisconsin. She was going to dig deeper than the Skoglunds, deeper than anyone in the valley, deeper than the cold could reach. And then she was going to keep her own. She rose at first light the next morning, and she went out and she went on digging. The first foot of earth came up easy. Black topsoil light and loose smelling of old roots and the rains of summer just passed. She worked it with a long-handled spade, lifting clean cuts and turning them onto a sheet of canvas she had laid beside the pit. The canvas would catch the spoil and let her wheelbarrow it out without leaving a trail in the shed floor. The second foot was harder. Subsoil dense with clay, dark with iron, coming up in stubborn, heavy clods that smelled of mineral and depth. She switched from the spade to a mattock. She worked in measured swings. She rested every 15 minutes, sitting on the edge of the pit with her hands flat on her knees, breathing slow. She was 62 years old. She was not the woman who had loaded hay wagons in the noonday sun in 1905. She paced herself the way an old horse paces itself, with attention and economy, taking nothing for granted. 3 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon. That was the rule she set herself. She did not break it. By the end of the third day, she was down a little over 3 feet. By the end of the fifth, she was down nearly 4. It was on the morning of the 6th day, the 17th of September, that the mattock struck something that did not feel like stone. She paused. She set the mattock down. She knelt at the bottom of the pit in the half-light, filtering through the open south face of the shed, and she brushed the loose subsoil away with her gloved hand. There was the corner of something, square, metal, rust-pitted but solid. She got down on both knees and she worked carefully now, with her fingers prying away the packed earth. A box. A square iron box, perhaps 8 inches on a side, the lid rusted shut along one seam but not the others. She lifted it up out of the hole and she set it on the canvas beside her. And she sat back on her heels in the half-darkness and stared at it for a long time. She did not recognize it. She did not for one full minute allow herself to recognize it. But she knew. Her hands were shaking just slightly when she pried at the lid with the corner of the mattock blade. The seam gave. The lid came up. Inside the box, wrapped in waxed paper that had gone brittle and stiff with the years, was a folded piece of heavy cardstock. She lifted it out. She unfolded it on her knees. It was a drawing, her father's hand. She knew it before her eyes had even focused. The square, neat letters, the careful pencil shading, the small annotations in the margins in the abbreviated farm Norwegian he had used all his life. A drawing of a root cellar, dimensions written in his own hand, 9 feet deep, stone-lined walls, sand and stone floor. A specific note about the roof hay over plank, then waxed canvas, then 12 inches of subsoil compressed by hand. The whole thing scaled and labeled. At the bottom of the drawing in larger letters, 3 lines for Sigrid. Minnesota is colder than Wisconsin. Dig deeper. She sat down hard on the canvas. The pit walls rose around her in the dim light. Above her, through the open south face of the shed, she could see a slice of pale September sky. He had been here. He had been here in 1925, the summer he had come north to visit her one last time. The summer she had not known would be the last. He had been a man of 85 then, walking with a cane, his hands swollen with arthritis, his eyes still clear. He had stayed with them for 10 days. He had walked the property with Magnus. He had sat on the porch in the long evenings and watched the western sky and said little. And at some point during those 10 days, while she had been busy with the preserves or the haying or the 100 small tasks of late summer, her father had walked out behind the woodshed with this iron box in his hand. He had buried it 4 feet down. He had said nothing about it to her. He had said nothing about it to Magnus. He had simply left it there for when she would need it. She remembered now the thing he had said to her at the train station in Brainerd in August of 1925, the thing she had not understood at the time. He had held her hand and he had looked past her shoulder at the train and he had said, "You will know what to do when the cold comes, daughter. I have made sure of that." She had thought he meant it the way old men mean such things. A blessing. A father's last reassurance to a daughter he would not see again. He had not meant it that way. He had meant it literally. She sat on the canvas at the bottom of the unfinished pit, and she pressed the cardstock drawing against her chest with both hands, and she wept. She did not weep often. She had not wept at Magnus's funeral, not where anyone could see her. She had not wept when the doctor from Brainerd had come too late. She had not wept in the long autumn nights of 1929, when the house had felt too large and the bed too cold. She wept now. She wept because her father dead. 4 years had reached forward across his own death to put a drawing in her hand on the morning of the 6th day of digging. She wept because he had known somehow that she would dig. That after Magnus was gone, after the cold had taken what it would take, she would come out behind the woodshed with a spade in her hand and the memory of his palm against the stone wall, and she would begin. She wept because she had not been alone, not for one moment of her life, not even now. When she was done, she folded the drawing carefully back into its waxed paper. She placed it back in the iron box. She set the box at the head of the pit where she could see it as she worked. Then she picked up the mattock again, and she went on digging. The drawing changed everything and it changed nothing. The principles were the same principles she had already half remembered from her childhood. Stone-lined walls, fire-heated floor stones, hay and canvas and earth roof, the depth she had already intended to reach, the ventilation she had already begun to plan. But there were details on the cardstock that she had not thought of, and that she would not have thought of in time. The exact thickness of the hay layer for Minnesota's deeper cold 4 inches and not 3. The specific instruction to overlap the canvas a full foot beyond the wall stones. A note about the floor stones that read in her father's careful hand, "Heat them in a sustained fire of at least 4 hours and bury them while still warm to the touch, but not hot. They will give back warmth for weeks." She read the drawing again on the morning of the 7th day by the light of the open shed, and she understood that her father had spent the last years of his life thinking about this, not as a kindness to her, not as a sentimental gesture, as an old farmer's serious technical labor refining a telemark design across 2 generations, and across the Atlantic and across 40 miles of latitude until the dimensions on the cardstock were not generic at all, but specific to her ground, her climate, her need. She worked from the drawing. By the end of the 11th day, she was 9 feet down. The walls she lined with flat fieldstone she had been collecting from the creek bank since July. 160 pounds of stone hauled in the wagon over 3 trips and stacked near the shed through the summer months. She set the stones dry without mortar, fitting them tight against the earth walls and tamping coarse sand into the gaps. Stone against earth, earth against stone. The principle her father had pressed into her memory with his palm against the telemark wall, and that he had refined for her on the back of a piece of cardstock 4 years before he died. The floor she treated with the specific care his note demanded. Packed earth, leveled flat, covered first with 3 inches of coarse, washed sand, then a course of smaller flat fieldstones, each one heated for 4 hours in a sustained bonfire. She built at the field edge and carried down into the pit, wrapped in burlap while still warm to the touch. 200 pounds of stone fire-heated and buried. A floor that would hold a trace of summer warmth for weeks against the deepest cold. The roof was the part that took the most time. She used 6-inch rough-sawn pine planks, laid across the 9-foot span in 2 sections, supported at the center by a beam mortised into notches cut into the stone walls themselves. Over the planks she packed 4 inches of the driest hay from last summer's cutting compressed by hand, layered like thatch. Over the hay she stretched a sheet of waxed canvas salvaged from a grain cover, overlapping the edges a full foot on each side, as the drawing had instructed, and tucking them down against the wallstones. Over the canvas she shoveled 12 inches of subsoil, pressed into a low arch with her hands and feet smoothed until it looked like undisturbed ground. Then she stacked the birch back over it, every split piece returned to exactly where it had been, the rows neat and ordinary. The hatch concealed beneath the 3rd row from the right, a 2-foot square of pine planks that lifted on a leather pull strap, invisible unless you moved the wood and knew what you were looking for. To anyone loading or pulling firewood from that shed, nothing had changed. The floor looked solid. The wood sat in its ordinary rows. The structure was the same building it had always been in the same corner of the same property, doing the same thing it had always done. That was part of the design. That was perhaps the most important part of the design. The neighbors noticed the way neighbors always do. The Vespi family, 2 miles to the north, were polite and distant. They had been since the afternoon Sigrid had quietly declined Mrs. Ingeborg Vespi's well-meant attempt in the spring after Magnus's death to introduce her to a widower from the next county. Some subtle door had closed between them after that. Mrs. Vespi was a tall, thin-lipped woman of about 50, the daughter of an old country minister, careful in her dress and careful in her judgments. And she did not forgive easily what she perceived as a slight to her good intentions. Sigrid did not blame her particularly. Mrs. Vespi's coldness was the cost of having declined, and the cost was a fair one. The Hanson brothers to the south were younger men unmarried who farmed together and observed most of what Sigrid did with the incurious shrug of people managing their own sufficient difficulties. It was Halvor Skoglund 3 miles east who said aloud what others had probably said privately. He had stopped his wagon at the foot of her lane one September afternoon. He did this occasionally just to pass the time the way men do when they have been alone with their thoughts all week. He could see the mound of displaced subsoil at the edge of the hayfield, where she had been dumping it for over a week. He could see the stacked creekstone near the shed, what little of it remained. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that does not fit the pattern he expects. Building something, improving the storage. Under the woodshed. She looked at him across the lane. Halvor Skoglund was a year older than Magnus had been. His beard had gone fully white. His eyes in the September light were the color of old slate. Yes. A pause. He turned his hat in his hands, which was the way he bought himself time when he was deciding whether to say a thing or leave it. He looked at the hayfield. He looked at the shed. He looked back at her. He left it. He clicked his horse forward. He drove on. 3 weeks later, through the ordinary channels of rural gossip, the general store in town, mostly sometimes the feed mill Sigrid heard, that the phrase that Auberg woman and her hole had made at least one public appearance. She heard it from Reinhard Krog, the grocer, in the way Reinhard Krog heard everything. Krog was a heavy, bald man in his late 50s, originally from a German Lutheran community in Wisconsin, who had run the general store in their township for 22 years. He was friendly enough on the surface, but he had a particular gift for repeating with apparent reluctance the unkind things that other people had said. He would lean across the counter while he wrote up her order, and he would say something like, "Well, you know how the Hansons talk," and then he would tell her exactly how the Hansons talked. "There's been some wondering," he said to her on the last day of September, while he was sliding a paper sack of coffee beans across the counter toward her, "about what a woman alone is doing with a hole in her woodshed." Sigrid paid him in exact change. "Some are saying gold," Krog said in the tone of a man passing along a confidence. "Some are saying she's gone strange. That kind of talk. You know how it is." She picked up her coffee. She picked up her sugar. She picked up the small tin of lamp oil she had come for. "I do know how it is, Mr. Krog," she said. She walked out of the store and she did not look back, and she drove the wagon home through the long slanting light of late September, with the talk of the township settled around her shoulders like a thin, cold cloak that she had decided some time back she did not need to shrug off. In the last days of September, she lowered her stores into the pit by lamplight, working carefully one slow trip at a time. 140 pounds of potatoes in burlap sacks, 60 pounds of turnips, 4 crocks of salted pork sealed with rendered fat, 11 quart jars of pickled beets and cabbage set in a wooden frame she had built to keep them from touching one another, 2 crocks of lard, a 50-pound sack of cornmeal inside a cedar box she had fitted with a tight-sealed lid to keep moisture out, a tin containing $40 in paper money, wrapped twice in oilcloth, and the iron box, her father's iron box. Empty now, the drawing folded back into its waxed paper and tucked inside the lid, closed against the cold. She set it on a flat stone in the corner of the pit where she could see it whenever she came down. A small square of him kept underground, where the ground itself would keep him. She climbed up the 8 steps cut into the earth wall. She replaced the hatch. She stacked the birch back over it. She walked back to the house in the long blue dusk of the last evening of September 1929. She did not know that this winter, the winter of 1929 and 1930, would be a mild one. She did not know that the pit would not be tested in earnest for another 15 months. She knew only that it was finished, that she had done what her father 55 years ago, and 4 years dead, had set her up to do. The first winter passed without incident. The temperatures that year never went below 22 degrees below zero, and the cellar held 41 and 42 degrees through the worst of it. She drew from her stores through January and February and into March, and the potatoes were firm, and the lard was sweet, and the pickled cabbage was bright and clean. She did not need the Skoglunds. She did not need the Hansons. She did not need anyone. In April, when the ground softened, she walked the property line by herself. She stood at the edge of the hayfield and watched the geese come north over the ridge. She thought about Magnus. She thought about her father. She thought about how strange it was to be 63 years old, alone on 80 acres, in a country her family had not lived in 3 generations before, and to feel for the first time in 2 years that the ground beneath her feet was hers. In May, she ordered seed corn from Krog's store. He waited out for her with his usual smile. He did not mention the hole. The talk had moved on the way talk does to other widows and other oddities. The summer of 1930 was hot and dry. The river ran low. The hayfields cured early. She brought in 2 cuttings without help, working slowly, taking what the days allowed. In August, she turned 64. She did not mark it. In September, she added a second course of stones to the floor of the pit. A small improvement she had been thinking about. 2 more inches of thermal mass. 40 pounds of fieldstone fire-heated buried warm. In October, the radio began to carry the first reports. She kept the radio on the kitchen table, a battery unit that she ran carefully 30 minutes in the morning and 30 minutes in the evening to save the cells. The voice that came out of it was thin and far away, scratched with distance, but the words were clear enough. A high-pressure ridge was building over the Canadian prairies. Meteorologists at the university in St. Paul were calling it unusual for so early in the season. The air mass was deep, the announcer said, and dense and showing no signs of moving. Sigrid sat at the kitchen table that October evening, with her hands folded on the oilcloth, listening. Outside the window, the maples were red. The light was the long, honeyed light of autumn in Minnesota. The kind of light that fooled you into thinking the world was not preparing for what it was preparing for. The radio voice said the words, Arctic air mass. Sigrid looked at the woodshed through the window. She did not smile. She did not move. She simply sat at the table in the evening light. And she listened to a man in St. Paul tell her in measured, careful tones that the cold was coming. That it was coming hard. That nothing in the valleys of northern Minnesota was going to stop it. Then she got up and she turned off the radio, and she went out to feed Clara and fast in the gathering dark. The first deep cold came in the second week of December, 14 below zero on the porch thermometer. She walked out to the woodshed at midday, moved aside the birch in the third row from the right, and lifted the hatch. The air that rose to meet her face was cool and faintly moist, but not cold, not biting. She climbed down the 8 steps. She held her bare hand at chest height, and she waited. 41 degrees, maybe 42. Outside 14 below. She stood at the bottom of the pit for a long moment. The lamplight fell on the crocks. The jars, the cedar box, the small iron box on the corner stone with her father inside it. She pressed her own palm flat against the stone wall. 5 points of contact. The same gesture. 55 years later. A different country, a different cellar, the same hand. The earth keeps summer longer than we do. She climbed back up. She replaced the hatch. She stacked the birch back into its rows. She walked to the house in the early winter dusk. She did not yet know that on the night of January 17th, the porch thermometer would read 38 below zero, that the cold would hold for 9 consecutive days, that a birch tree in the north woodlot would split open at 3 in the morning, with a sound like a rifle shot, and that she would lie awake afterward listening to the world go silent under the weight of an Arctic air mass that meteorologists in St. Paul would later call the worst in living memory. She did not yet know that on the morning of the 9th day she would walk into her barn and find Clara dying, that her hands would go numb twice as she built a wall of hay and canvas in the wind, that she would press her cheek against her cow's warm side at 20 below and feel the slow, deliberate breathing, and decide that she would not let one more living thing in her care be lost to the cold. She did not yet know that a track of strange boots would appear in the dust of her woodshed floor on the morning of the 5th day, and that she would take Magnus's rifle down off the wall and sleep with it beside her bed for 4 nights. She did not yet know that a woman she had thought was her enemy would come crawling through the snow at first light on the 10th day with frostbite on her cheek and a pride in her chest that the cold had finally mercifully broken. She did not yet know that Halvor Skoglund would tap his hat in his hands one last time at her kitchen table in March and tell her about her father and his father, and a Wisconsin summer in 1889 that she had never heard of in her life. She did not know any of it. She knew only that the cold was coming, that the radio had said so, and that she was ready. The first hard test came on a morning in early December 1930, when Sigrid Aberg woke to find her bedroom window glazed thick with feather frost, and the iron handle of her water bucket frozen to the floorboards beside the kitchen stove. She had let the box stove down to embers overnight to save wood. She regretted it now. She crouched beside it in her wool nightdress with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, and she fed in 2 pieces of birch and a handful of pine kindling, and she blew on the coals until they caught. The fire took. The first heat began to lift into the kitchen. She pulled on her boots without bothering to lace them, and she stepped out onto the porch to look at the thermometer. 26 below. It was December 11th. The cold had come early, a full month earlier than the cold of an ordinary year. She stood on the porch in her nightdress and her boots, and she felt the cold pressing in against her shins, and she did not move for nearly a minute, just looking out at the white land and the bare trees and the smoke rising straight up from her own chimney into a sky so still it might have been painted. Then she went back inside. She dressed slowly and carefully the way she had begun to dress in winter since Magnus had died, taking the time to do it right, because there was no one else to notice if she did it wrong. Long underwear, 2 pairs of wool stockings, a heavy wool skirt over a cotton petticoat, her father's old wool overcoat, which she kept on a peg beside the door now and put on whenever the air outside dipped below 0. Boots, mittens, a knit cap pulled down over her ears. She drank a cup of black coffee standing at the kitchen window. She watched the steam rise from the cup and disappear into the cold air near the glass. She walked out to the woodshed. The snow in the yard was crusted hard from the previous week's thaw and refreeze. Her boots made small, precise sounds as she crossed it. She moved aside the 3rd row of birch from the right. She knelt down on the packed earth floor of the shed. She lifted the hatch. The air that rose up out of the pit met her face like a held breath. Cool, faintly moist, carrying the smell of stone and earth and the faint vegetal sweetness of stored potatoes. Not cold, not biting, just the quiet held warmth of summer that had not yet been released. She climbed down the 8 steps. She had brought a small lantern. She hung it on the iron hook she had driven into the wall stones near the bottom of the steps. The light fell on the crocks and the jars in the cedar box. It fell on the small iron box in the corner where her father waited. She held her bare hand at chest height. She waited a slow 10 count. 41 degrees. Outside 26 below. A spread of 67 degrees between the surface of the world and the chamber she had cut beneath it. She let her breath out slowly. She had not realized she had been holding it. She pressed her palm flat against the stone wall in the gesture that was now hers and her father's both, and she stood that way in the lamplight for a long moment. Then she climbed back up. She replaced the hatch. She stacked the birch back into its rows. She walked to the barn to feed Clara and fast. The cold of December 11th held for 2 days, lifted briefly to single digits below 0. And then settled back into the high teens below for most of the rest of the month. The pit, when she checked it on the 20th and again on the 27th, held at 40 and 41 degrees. A degree of variation, nothing more. She allowed herself in the long evenings of late December a quiet feeling that was not quite pride. It was closer to confirmation. The thing she had built was doing what she had built it to do. The drawing on her father's cardstock had been correct, and the labor of 11 September days had been correct, and the principles he had pressed into her at 9 years old were after 55 years vindicated. On Christmas Eve, she sat alone at the kitchen table with a small ham steak and a plate of fried potatoes from her own stores. The radio was on. Somewhere far away, a choir was singing in Norwegian. She listened to the words she had not heard sung since her childhood, and she did not weep, but she set down her fork, and she pressed her hand flat against the oilcloth on the table, and she remembered for a moment what it had been to be young in Wisconsin in 1875. On the morning of the 3rd of January, the thermometer read 19 below at sunrise. The radio that evening reported that a high-pressure ridge had locked over northern Minnesota and showed no signs of movement. Arctic air, the announcer said, was flowing down from the Canadian prairies in a dense, continuous mass. The forecast was not specific. It was simply colder. By the morning of January 7th, the reading was 28 below. By the morning of January 14th, 29 below. At sunrise, and 33 below. By 9 in the evening. On the morning of January the 17th, Sigrid Aberg walked out onto her porch in the pre-dawn dark and held her lantern up to the thermometer. 38 below zero. She stood looking at the column of red alcohol for a long time. She had never seen it that low. Magnus had never seen it that low. Her father in 50 years of Wisconsin winters had never seen it that low. The yard around her was perfectly silent. The cold pressed against her face and her exposed wrists, where her mittens met her sleeves, and within 30 seconds, she had to pull her wrists up inside the cuffs of the overcoat to keep the skin from beginning to ache. She went back inside. She built up the kitchen range and the parlor stove and the small box stove in the bedroom, all three at once. She set water to heat. She sat down at the kitchen table with a pencil and a piece of paper from the seed catalog drawer, and she did the arithmetic she had been putting off doing. 4 cords of birch in the woodshed. Burn rate in cold like this of roughly 1 rick per day. 16 ricks to a cord. 64 ricks total. 64 days if the cold held at this temperature, which she did not think it could. 45 days if the cold deepened or the wind picked up. Less if she had to keep the barn from going below 10 above zero, which was the line she had already set in her own mind for Clara. She had wood for the rest of January. She had wood for most of February. She did not have wood for March. But March was March, and now was now, and the cold of now was the only cold that mattered. She folded the paper. She tucked it into the seed catalog drawer. She poured herself a cup of black coffee from the pot on the back of the range, and she stood at the kitchen window and she watched the slow red sun come up over the eastern timber. The cold of January 17th was a different kind of cold than the cold of December 11th. The cold of December had been a hard cold, the kind that settled into the bones of a body and the bones of a building and made everything brittle. But it had been a familiar cold, Minnesota cold, the cold she had lived through 26 winters of and that her body, even at 64, knew how to manage. The cold of January 17th was something else. It was a cold that did not belong to any season she had a name for. It was a cold that did not behave the way cold was supposed to behave. The moisture in her exhaled breath did not drift in front of her face. It crystallized at once and fell a faint shimmer of ice, falling onto the front of her overcoat as she walked from the house to the barn. Her eyelashes froze together if she blinked too long. The leather hinges of the barn door had locked solid in the night. It took her 20 minutes of patient work with a candle held close to the metal before they would move. Inside the barn, Clara stood in her stall and watched Sigrid come in. The cow's breath plumed out and froze. The water in the trough was solid except for a small black hole at the center where the floating wood block had kept the surface working. Sigrid broke the ice in the bucket with the back of a hatchet. She carried hot water from the kitchen range, 2 buckets at a time, and poured it slowly into the trough. She rubbed Clara's flanks with the flat of her hand to bring the blood up. She forked extra hay into the rack. She murmured low and steady the half-songs her mother had used in the byre in Wisconsin 60 years ago. Words that were not really words anymore, just sounds that an animal knew. Clara drank. The barn thermometer on the center post read 14 above. Better than she had hoped in the 3rd hour of a 38 below morning. The barn was old, but it was tight, and the bodies of the animals themselves did much of the work of keeping it warm. She left the barn at 8 o'clock and crossed back to the woodshed. She wanted to check the pit before the day got busy. She moved aside the birch. She lifted the hatch. She climbed down. She held her hand at chest height, 41 degrees, outside 38 below, a difference of 79 degrees between the surface and the cellar floor. 8 degrees more spread than she had ever asked of the pit, and the pit was holding it. She allowed herself a moment that was longer than the moments she usually allowed herself. She stood in the lamplight, and she pressed her hand flat against the stone wall, and she thought about her father, about the cardstock drawing, about the 4-hour bonfire she had built at the field edge in September of 1929, and the burlap-wrapped stones she had carried down warm. She thought about the 4 inches of hay her father had specified, instead of 3, and about the foot of canvas overlap, and about the 2nd course of fire-heated stones she had added the previous September. That was, she could feel doing exactly what she had hoped it would do. The pit was holding the line. She climbed up. She replaced the hatch. She stacked the birch. She walked back to the house through air so cold it crackled when she breathed. The 3rd night of the cold was the first night she did not sleep well. It was not the cold itself that woke her. The bedroom held at 58 degrees with the small box stove fed twice through the night, and her 3 quilts and the heavy wool comforter Magnus's mother had given them as a wedding gift kept her body warm enough that she did not even feel the chill of the room when she shifted under the blankets. It was the sounds. A birch tree in the north woodlot split open at 3 in the morning, with a crack so loud that Sigrid sat straight up in bed, her heart racing, before she understood what it was. A 2nd tree split 20 minutes later farther off. The river, frozen solid, groaned under the pressure of the new cold, deepening into its ice. A long, low sound like the slow turning of an enormous iron wheel. Somewhere out behind the barn, a great horned owl called once, twice, and went silent. She lay in the dark, and she listened to the world remaking itself under the weight of the cold. She thought about her father. She thought about the iron box, about the cardstock drawing folded inside it, about the way he had stood at the train station in Brainerd in 1925 and said the thing she had not understood until she had needed to understand it. She thought with a sudden and unwelcome clarity about Magnus. Magnus had loved this house. Magnus had loved this land. Magnus had built the woodshed with his own hands in their 2nd summer, cutting the cedar shakes on the back porch. In August, the rhythm of the froe and the mallet steady through the long evenings. Magnus had been the one who first walked the line where the ridge broke the northwest wind and said, "This is where the shed goes." Magnus would never have approved of the pit. That was the thing she had not let herself think about in any direct way in the 15 months since she had finished it. He had not been a man without imagination, but he had been a man who liked things to be where they appeared to be. The sealed cellar under the house was where you kept your stores. The barn was where you kept your animals. The shed was where you kept your wood. A man knew these things. A neighbor walking onto your property knew these things too. The order of a farm for Magnus had been part of the dignity of it, and he had not held with secrecy as a way of life. Sigrid lay in the dark, and she let herself imagine for a moment the conversation they had never had. The conversation that in another life, in a winter where Magnus had not died in July of 1929, they would have sat down at the kitchen table and had together. She would have laid out her father's drawing. She would have explained the principles. She would have argued for it. He would have listened. He always listened, but he would not have said yes. Not to that. Not to digging beneath the woodshed in the dark. Not to lining the walls and roofing the chamber and stacking the birch back over the hatch as if nothing had changed. He would have said, "Sigrid, if we need a deeper cellar, we will dig a deeper cellar. And we will dig it where a cellar belongs, and we will dig it together." And she would have agreed. And there would be no pit beneath the woodshed tonight, and the cold would be coming anyway. She lay in the dark, and she listened to the birch trees split open in the woodlot. And she understood for the first time clearly that the woman who had dug the pit was a woman Magnus had never met. A woman she had become only in the 16 months between his death and the September she had picked up the spade. A woman who had stood in her own dooryard in 1927 and watched another family's preserves come into her house and had decided in some place below the level of language that she would never stand in that doorway again. The pit was hers, not theirs, not his. Hers. For some women, that thought might have come with guilt. She found that it did not. She found that it came with something quieter and more solid. The recognition that she had built the thing she had needed to build alone with her own hands, and the hand of her dead father, reaching forward across his death to help her, and that the pit beneath the woodshed was the most truly hers of any structure on the property. She turned over in the bed. The wool comforter shifted against her shoulder. Outside, far off, another birch split open with a sound like a rifle shot. She slept finally around 4 in the morning. The 4th and 5th days of the cold passed in a kind of blurred discipline. She rose before dawn. She built up the fires. She thawed the water bucket. She walked to the barn and tended Clara and Fast. She forked hay. She broke ice in the trough. She rubbed warmth back into the cow's flanks. She walked back to the house. She drank coffee. She walked to the woodshed and checked the pit. She walked back to the house. She cooked. She mended. She listened to the radio for 30 minutes in the morning and 30 minutes in the evening. The radio on the 5th day reported that the high-pressure ridge over the Canadian prairies had not moved, that the cold was expected to hold for at least 3 more days, possibly 4, that the city of Duluth had recorded 41 below zero overnight, that 2 elderly men in different townships had been found frozen in their dooryards. Sigrid turned off the radio. She walked out to the woodshed at midday on the 5th day, January 21st, and she lifted the hatch. She climbed down the 8 steps with her lantern. She knew at once that something was wrong. She had developed in the 15 months of using the pit a particular sense for the air at the bottom of the steps, the smell of stone and earth, the faint sweetness of stored potatoes, the dry coolness that did not vary. The air today carried a different note, a trace of something colder, sharper. Not cold itself exactly. The pit was still holding at 40 degrees. She could feel it on the back of her hand. But something had changed. She held the lantern up. She saw it on the second sweep of the light, a small dark line in the canvas of the roof, 3 inches, maybe 4. A tear where some small animal, a marten or a weasel or a young raccoon that had found its way under the snow and into the back wall of the shed, at some point during the autumn, had worked at the canvas with its teeth and finally broken through. The hay above the canvas was packed tight. The earth above the hay was packed tighter. The breach was small. It had not yet allowed any meaningful amount of cold air to drop into the pit, but it would, slowly, steadily. Over the course of the next 48 hours, that small tear would let the brutal cold of the open air begin to work its way down through the hay layer, and from the hay layer through the canvas itself, and the canvas would begin to fail along the line of the tear, and the breach would widen, and the pit would lose the 79-degree differential it had been maintaining, and the temperature down here would begin slowly at first, and then faster to drop. If the cold held another 4 days, if the breach widened, if she did not act, she set the lantern on the corner stone, and she stood in the small chamber, and she did not move for half a minute. She was 64 years old. She was 4 hours into a day where the surface temperature had been 41 below at sunrise. Her hands, even now in the warmth of the pit, ached from the morning's work in the barn. Her shoulders, after 5 days of doubled wood carrying and fire tending, were a slow, constant pain. She was going to have to fix it. She climbed back up the 8 steps. She stacked the birch back into its rows over the hatch because a habit was a habit, and you did not break habits in cold like this. She walked back to the house. She did not let herself sit down. She knew that if she sat down, she would not get up again until evening. She walked straight through the kitchen and into the back room where Magnus's tools still hung on the wall pegs where he had left them, and she took down the heavy curved sail needle and the spool of waxed thread he had used for canvas work in his last years, and the 4-inch square of waxed canvas she had saved from the original grain cover and stored in the cedar box on the high shelf for exactly this purpose. And she carried them back to the kitchen. She heated the needle in the flame of the lamp. She threaded the waxed thread. She put on her overcoat. She put on her mittens. She walked back to the woodshed. She moved aside the birch. She lifted the hatch. She climbed down. The work itself took 40 minutes. She had to do it from below, lying on her back, on the stone floor of the pit. The lantern hung from the iron hook beside her head, her arms reaching up over her chest to push the curved sail needle through the canvas of the roof. Each stitch had to pierce both the existing canvas and the small patch she was sewing over the tear. The waxed thread had to be drawn tight without tearing the canvas further. The patch had to overlap the tear by a full inch on every side. It was not difficult work. She had done canvas work in the summers most of her life, stitching covers for the hay wagons and patching grain sacks. Her hands knew the motions, but she was lying on her back on a stone floor at the bottom of a 9-foot pit. The lantern light flickered. The pit was 40 degrees, which meant the canvas itself was somewhere between 40 and the wild cold above it, and her bare fingers, when she had to take her mittens off to draw the thread tight, went numb in under 3 minutes. She would work for 2 minutes, lower her hands, breathe on them inside her overcoat, work for 2 more minutes, breathe again. The first stitch went in at 12:40 in the afternoon. The last stitch went in at 1:20. She tied off the thread. She bit it through with her teeth. She sat up slowly on the stone floor, and she sat there for a long minute with her hands tucked up inside the sleeves of the overcoat, breathing. The patch was good. She tested it with her bare palm pressed against the canvas underneath. The cold of the breach was gone. The canvas held. She climbed up the 8 steps. She replaced the hatch. She stacked the birch. She walked back to the house. She drank a cup of black coffee standing at the kitchen window. Her hands were shaking just slightly, but she was not sure if the shaking was from the cold, or from the effort, or from the recognition that she had in fact been able to do what she had needed to do alone at 64, at 26 below zero on the surface and 40 in the pit. She sat down at the kitchen table for the first time that day. She did not get up again for an hour. The dawn of the 7th day of the cold was the morning everything narrowed. She walked out onto the porch at 6 in the morning to read the thermometer, and the column of red alcohol stood at 36 below. She walked across the yard to the woodshed by lantern light. The crust on the snow squeaked under her boots in the way snow squeaked only at temperatures below 30, below a sound that was almost dry, almost grain-like. The breath crystals from her own face fell onto the front of her overcoat as she walked. She moved aside the birch in the third row from the right. She paused. Something was different. She held the lantern lower. She crouched down. She looked at the packed earth floor of the woodshed. A boot print. Not hers. Hers were rounded at the toe and worn at the right heel where she favored that side a little. This print was longer, narrower, with a flat heel and a square toe. A man's work boot. A size she did not know. Pressed into the dust of the woodshed floor right beside the hatch. She did not move. She did not lift the hatch. She knelt there in the lamplight with her gloved hand resting on the cold, packed earth. And she looked at the boot print, and she felt something cold and small turn over inside her chest. The print was not fresh. The dust that had drifted across the toe of it suggested it was perhaps a day old. Perhaps a day and a half. Sometime in the evening of the 5th day or the morning of the 6th, while she had been in the house tending the fires and not paying attention to the woodshed, someone had been in here. Someone who had stepped deliberately right beside the hatch. She did not know if the hatch had been opened. The birch above it sat in its ordinary rows. The leather pull strap was tucked into its slot. Nothing she could see suggested that the cover had been lifted and replaced. But somebody had been here. In 36 below cold in the dark in her woodshed, somebody had walked across her property and stepped right next to the 1 square foot of ground on her entire 80 acres that contained anything worth having. She stood up slowly. Her knees ached. Her hands ached. The cold pressed against her face. She did not lift the hatch. She stacked the birch back into its place, just as it had been, every piece exactly where it had been before. She turned and she walked back to the house through the pre-dawn dark, and her own boot prints going and coming were the only fresh tracks on the new powder. Whoever had been there had come and gone before the snow of the previous night, 2 days ago at minimum, long enough that she would not catch them tonight. But they had been there, and they knew, or at least suspected, where to look. She came into the kitchen and she shut the door behind her, and she stood with her back to the door for a moment in the warmth. Then she walked into the back room. She took down Magnus's rifle from the wall pegs over the bed. She checked the action. She cleaned it slowly at the kitchen table with the lantern lit and the radio off, and she loaded 6 cartridges into the magazine, and she set the rifle on the chair next to the bed. She did not sleep well that night or the next or the next. She kept the rifle on the chair beside her, where her hand could find it in the dark. She listened. The cold continued. The radio reported on the morning of the 8th day that the high-pressure ridge was beginning finally to weaken at its western edge, but that the worst of the cold was expected to hold for another 48 hours. The cold was not done with her yet. She thought in those long nights about who it might have been. She did not want to think the obvious thoughts. The Hanson brothers were younger men who farmed without much money. 3 months ago, she might have suspected them. But the boot was wrong. The Hansons had narrow feet, both of them, and bought their boots at the same supplier in Brainerd. This print had been wider in the ball than that. Reinhard Krogh, the grocer in town, had a boot that might match. But Reinhard Krogh was a heavy, bald man in his late 50s who did not, so far as she could tell, leave his store after dark in any weather, let alone walk 3 miles out of town in a 30 below cold to pry at a widow's woodshed. There were drifters that winter. The radio said so. Men out of work, out of warmth, riding the rails north and south through the small Minnesota towns, looking for what they could find. It might have been any one of them, or it might have been someone she knew. That was the thought she did not want to have. That was the thought that kept her awake in the small hours of the 8th and the 9th nights, with Magnus's rifle on the chair beside her. On the morning of the 9th day, January 25th, she walked out at first light to feed Clara and Fasta, and she opened the barn door, and she felt the difference at once. The barn was too cold. She looked at the thermometer on the center post. The column read 9 above 0. Clara stood at the far wall with her head lowered, breathing in shallow pulls. Her weight shifted forward toward her front legs. The water in the trough had frozen over completely, even with the floating wood block. The light from the small high window fell on the cow's flank, and Sigrid could see even from the doorway that the warmth that should have been there was not. She crossed the barn and she pressed her gloved hand against Clara's flank, thinner than it should have been, the body doing the hard work of maintaining core temperature, pulling resources inward, leaving the periphery to fend for itself. The breathing too fast. The cow's legs cold from the hock down to the hoof. 9 above. After 3 days of 35 and 36 below outside. Clara had eaten well through the autumn. She was carrying good winter condition. She had survived 4 previous Minnesota winters in this barn. But she had not survived this. Not yet. Not if Sigrid let it continue. Sigrid stood with her hand on Clara's flank and she looked through the open barn door across the 4-foot gap at the woodshed. She and Magnus had talked about closing that gap one summer, 25 years ago, about building a connecting passage between the two structures the way some of the older farms in the valley had done. They had never gotten to it. She looked at the gap. She looked at the barn. She looked at the thermometer. She did the calculation that people do in emergencies, not the ideal solution, the sufficient one. She was not going to be able to warm the barn. She had nothing to warm it with. The kitchen range was a kitchen range. She could not safely run a fire in a board and batten structure built 50 feet from her woodpile and her hayloft. She was going to have to reduce the rate at which cold entered the barn. She was going to have to seal the gap that the wind had been driving through like a funnel, cut the drafts that had been stripping the residual warmth from the air, faster than Clara's body could replace it. The mathematics of insulation. Every gap sealed was a loss prevented. Every layer added between an animal and a 36 below wind was degrees recovered at no fuel cost. She went back to the house. She got 2 hay bales down from the loft. She unwired them and opened them into loose mass. She got the second sheet of waxed canvas from the cedar box on the high shelf, the remnant section 12 feet long. She got 4 lengths of rough sawn 2x6 from where they were stacked in the shed rafters. She got the spool of baling wire and the hammer and the box of 8-penny nails. She built a partition across the 4-foot gap between the two structures. Not a wall exactly. A wind barrier. A second insulating layer. The hay compressed and stacked to fill the gap's width. The canvas stretched over and around the hay and nailed into the wooden walls of the barn on one side and the shed on the other. The 2x6s braced diagonally to hold the whole assembly against the wind that came around the north end of the ridge in sustained flat gusts. It took her an hour and 20 minutes. Her fingers went numb twice. Both times she pressed them against Clara's neck and held them there until the joints came back, standing with her cheek resting against the animal's warm side, feeling the slow, deliberate breathing. What she was doing was not complicated and it was not elegant. She was sealing what she could seal. She was layering what she could layer. She was using hay and canvas and rough lumber and baling wire to do the work that in another life in a richer farm she might have done with proper insulation. board and a furnace and a heated water trough and a barn built tight from the start. She did not have those things. She had this. By mid-afternoon, the barn thermometer read 13 above. She brought 2 buckets of hot water from the kitchen range, walking quickly with her arms wrapped around them to hold the heat. Clara drank both in long, deliberate pulls. Sigrid stood beside her cow with her hand on Clara's neck, and she said softly in the half-Norwegian her mother had used in the byre, "It's all right. It's all right. We are all right." By evening, the barn was 14 above and holding. Clara had moved on her own to the hayrack, which was the last signal Sigrid needed. She walked back to the house in the early winter dusk. She built up the kitchen range. She heated water for tea and did not drink it. She sat down in the chair beside the kitchen stove, and she meant only to rest her eyes for a moment. She slept where she sat with her overcoat still on, with Magnus's rifle leaning against the chair beside her, with the stove ticking quietly through the long, deep night of the 9th day of the cold. She woke hours later to a sound she did not at first recognize. The kitchen was dark. The stove had burned down. The lamp on the table had gone out. The sound came again, a small, heavy sound from the direction of the woodshed, wood shifting. Something moving birch in the dark. She sat up in the chair. Her body was stiff. Her hand found the rifle. She stood. She crossed to the kitchen window. She looked out into the dooryard, which was lit by the faint blue pre-dawn light reflecting off the snow. She could see the woodshed. She could see very faintly a shape moving inside it. She lifted the rifle. She walked to the door. She put on her boots without lacing them. She opened the door slowly, and she stepped out onto the porch with the rifle held low across her body, and her breath rising white in the air in front of her face. She walked down the porch steps. She crossed the yard toward the woodshed. Whoever was in there had not yet seen her. She crossed the last 15 feet of frozen yard with the rifle held low across her body and the cold pressing against her face like a held hand. And the figure in the woodshed did not see her until she was within 10 feet of the open south face. Then it turned. For one long second, Sigrid Aberg did not move. Her finger was beside the trigger guard, not on it. Her father had taught her 60 years ago in the Wisconsin timber that a rifle was a tool you put your finger on only when you had decided to use it. She had not decided. The figure in the lamplight, half crouched between the 3rd and 4th rows of stacked birch, was Mrs. Ingeborg Vestby, the tall, thin-lipped woman from 2 miles north, who had not spoken a kind word to Sigrid in 19 months. The minister's daughter, the woman who had decided in the spring after Magnus's death that Sigrid's quiet refusal of her well-meant introduction had been a personal offense. She was on her knees in the dust of the woodshed floor. She was wearing a man's overcoat that did not fit her, and a knit cap pulled down over her ears, and her hands ungloved were red and stiff. The leather pull strap of the hatch was in her right hand. The hatch itself was lifted 6 inches. Her eyes met Sigrid's across the lantern light. Neither of them spoke. The hatch slipped out of Mrs. Vestby's hand and fell back into its frame with a small, heavy sound. She sat down on the woodshed floor, slowly, as if her legs had stopped holding her. Sigrid lowered the rifle. She looked at the older woman in the lamplight, at the white circle of frostbite on her left cheek that she had clearly not yet noticed, at the way her right hand was held against her chest. The way the hand is held when the fingers are too numb to feel. "How long have you been outside, Ingeborg?" The first name. Sigrid had not used it in 19 months. Mrs. Vestby's mouth opened. It closed. She looked down at the hatch beneath her, at the leather pull strap, at her own ungloved hands. "Since first light," she said. Her voice was thin. "I did not." I did not mean. Sigrid set the rifle against the inside wall of the shed. She crossed the floor in 3 steps, and she crouched down in front of Mrs. Vespi, and she put both her gloved hands against Mrs. Vespi's bare hands, and she held them there. The other woman flinched. Her hands were too cold to feel warmth as warmth. They felt warmth in that state only as pain. "Stand up," Sigrid said. "I cannot." "You can. We are not doing this here." Mrs. Vespi looked up at her. Her eyes in the lantern light were the eyes of a woman who had stopped pretending. The careful pride that had kept the door closed between them for 19 months was gone out of her face. There was only exhaustion now, and something underneath the exhaustion that Sigrid recognized at once, because she had carried it herself in her own dooryard in February of 1927. She helped Mrs. Vespi to her feet. She put her arm under the older woman's shoulder. She walked her slowly across the 4-foot gap she had sealed the day before, around the south side of the barn, across the yard up the porch steps, and into the warmth of the kitchen. She sat Mrs. Vespi down in the chair beside the stove. She built the fire up. She set water to heat. She knelt in front of the chair, and she took off Mrs. Vespi's wet boots and her wet wool stockings, and she rubbed Mrs. Vespi's feet with the flat of her hands, slow and steady the way her mother had rubbed warmth back into the feet of farm hands brought in from the snow in Wisconsin 60 years ago. She did not speak. Mrs. Vespi did not speak. The kitchen filled slowly with steam and the small, careful sounds of 2 old women in a warm room in a cold morning. The cold outside was beginning at last to lift. The radio on the table, when Sigrid switched it on at 7, reported that the high-pressure ridge had finally moved off to the east during the night. The temperature on her porch thermometer was 22 below. Cold enough to kill a man. 12 degrees warmer than it had been 24 hours before. When Mrs. Vespi's feet had pinked up and the dangerous white circle on her cheek had begun slowly to redden again, Sigrid stood up. She poured hot water into a tin cup. She put a spoonful of honey in it from the small crock in the cupboard. She handed it to Mrs. Vespi. She sat down across the table. "Drink that." Mrs. Vespi drank. She set the cup down on the oilcloth and she folded her hands around it. And she looked at her hands and she said in a voice that had gone very small, "Ada is sick." Sigrid waited. Ada was Mrs. Vespi's youngest. A girl of about 7, the late child Mrs. Vespi had born at 43. Sigrid had seen her at the church in Brainerd a year ago. A small, dark-haired girl, quiet with her mother's careful manners. How sick? Fever. 4 days. Mrs. Vespi's voice did not rise. It stayed flat the way the voices of women stay flat when they have spent 4 days holding back the sound that wants to come out. "I have been giving her broth. We have potatoes still, but most are. Most are frozen. The cellar." She stopped. "The cellar froze through on the 5th day. You lost your stores." "Most of them, yes." "Why did you not come to the door?" Mrs. Vespi did not answer. She lifted the cup of hot water to her lips. She set it back down. She looked finally at Sigrid across the table. "I have been a small woman to you, Sigrid Aberg," she said. "For 19 months, I have been a small woman." Sigrid did not contradict her. "I would not have been able to look at your face," Mrs. Vespi said, "and ask you for what I needed. I would have died first. I almost did." She picked up the cup again. She put it back down without drinking. "My husband is in the next county helping his brother. He left on the 15th. He thought he would be back in 3 days. The cold caught him there. The roads. I have been alone with Ada and the boys for 10 days. Her hands went tight around the tin cup. I came here last night, to the woodshed. I had heard. The talk about the hole, I thought. She stopped. She made herself say it. I thought I would take only what we needed, and no one would know, and I would never have to look at your face. You came twice, Sigrid said. I came 3 times. The boot print I saw was 3 days ago. Yes. The first time I could not lift the wood. I was not strong enough. I went home. She looked down at her hands. I came back the next night. I lifted some of the wood that time. I could see the hatch. I went home again. She paused. Last night I did not go home. I sat in the shed for 2 hours before I touched the hatch. I was trying to make myself open it. The kitchen was very quiet. Sigrid stood up. She walked to the window. She looked out at the yard, at the woodshed, at the thin red line of the morning sun, beginning to come up over the eastern timber. She thought about February of 1927, about standing in her own doorway with her hand pressed against the frame and watching Magnus carry Anna Skoglund's preserves into her kitchen. About the small, hard place that had contracted inside her chest in that moment, and about how she had spent the next 2.5 years building a chamber under the woodshed so that the small, hard place would never be required to contract again. She thought about how that small, hard place had been at the bottom of it pride. She turned back from the window. You have not eaten, she said. Not properly. Not in 3 days. Sit. I will fry potatoes. Mrs. Vesby looked up at her. Her face in the morning light through the kitchen window was the face of a woman who had not expected to be fed. Sigrid. Sit, Ingeborg. Sigrid fried potatoes in lard from one of the crocks that had been in the pit since September of 1929. She fried them with onions from a small braid hanging in the kitchen and salt from the tin on the shelf. And she fried 2 thick slices of salted pork alongside them. And she set the plate in front of Mrs. Vesby with a slice of brown bread and a 2nd cup of hot water with honey. And she did not watch her eat. She walked out to the woodshed. She moved aside the birch in the 3rd row from the right. She lifted the hatch. She climbed down the 8 steps with her lantern. She looked at her stores by the lamplight. 140 pounds of potatoes she had put down in September of 1929. She had drawn perhaps 30 pounds through the winter of 1929 and 1930, and another 30 through the autumn of 1930, and the early winter just passed. 80 pounds remained. 60 pounds of turnips less what she had used. 4 crocks of salted pork, 2 of which she had not opened. 2 crocks of lard. 11 jars of pickled cabbage and beets. A 50-pound sack of cornmeal in the cedar box. $40 in paper money in the oilcloth. She looked at the small iron box on the corner stone. She stood for a moment in the lamplight. Then she filled an empty burlap sack she kept folded at the bottom of the steps. She filled it slowly, deliberately, with the care of a woman, counting out something she could not afford to lose. 20 pounds of potatoes, 10 pounds of turnips, a jar of pickled cabbage, a jar of pickled beets, a small crock of lard sealed and unopened, a 2-pound chunk of salted pork wrapped in waxed paper, a pound of cornmeal scooped from the cedar box into a smaller cloth bag. She tied the sack shut. She climbed up the 8 steps. She replaced the hatch. She stacked the birch. She carried the sack into the kitchen. Mrs. Vesby had eaten. Her plate was clean. She was sitting with her hands folded around the empty cup, looking at the oilcloth on the table. Sigrid set the burlap sack on the floor beside the chair. "This is for Ada," she said, "and for your boys, and for you." Mrs. Vesby looked at the sack. She looked at Sigrid. "I cannot." "You can. You will." I came here to steal from you, Sigrid. You came here because Ada is sick and you have small children at home and your husband was caught on the wrong side of a blizzard. You came here because you were afraid. You came here because the cold takes from us what the cold wants, and you were trying alone to keep your children alive. You did not come here to steal. You came here to feed your daughter. Sigrid sat down across the table. I had a sister, Ingeborg. Did you know that in Wisconsin? Her name was Marat. She died of the lung fever in 1879 when she was 4 years old, and I was 13. My mother did not. My mother was never the same. She paused. I do not have children. Magnus and I were not given them. I have tried in 64 years not to think about the small ones I did not have. But I have not always succeeded. Mrs. Vespy's eyes had filled. She did not blink. You will take this sack home, Sigrid said, and you will boil broth for Ada with the pork and the turnips, and you will mash potatoes in lard and honey and feed them to her by the spoonful. And you will give the cornmeal to the boys, and you will use the lard to keep your bread for another month. And when your husband comes home, you will tell him what you did. And if he is the man I think he is, he will say to you what Magnus would have said to me. He will say, Ingeborg, you were right to go. Sigrid, I am not finished. Mrs. Vespy waited. Tomorrow morning, Sigrid said, you will come back, or one of your boys will come back, and you will bring me a list of what you lost in that cellar. And we will see what else is needed, and we will find a way to get through the rest of the winter. Not as a charity. As a debt I am extending to you, that you will repay me. In some other winter, in some other way. Do you understand? Mrs. Vespy did not speak. She nodded once, slowly. Now, Sigrid said, put your boots on. They are dry. I will hitch fast to the small sled, and I will take you home. You will not walk back 2 miles in this cold. Mrs. Vespy put on her boots. At the door, with the burlap sack in her hand, she paused. She looked at Sigrid. I am ashamed. I know, Sigrid said. Be ashamed for 1 hour, then put it down. There is too much to do. The cold broke fully on the morning of the 11th day. The thermometer read 12 below at sunrise, single digits below by midday. By the third afternoon, the wind shifted out of the southwest, and the air took on the soft, heavy weight that meant snow was coming, and snow did come a foot of it, over 2 days, gentle, almost warm. The talk came in with the break in the cold, through the ordinary channels. The Skoglund place had come through the cold intact, with reduced stores but no losses. The Hansens had lost a yearling calf on the 8th night. A farmer named Hess, 8 miles east, had lost 3 milk cows, and most of a small flock of sheep, more than he was willing to say publicly. The Lindstrom family on the South Road had nearly burned through their entire wood supply, and were borrowing from neighbors to get through February. 2 old men from the next township had been found in their dooryards, as the radio had said. A drifter of about 30 had been found frozen in a hayrick 3 miles outside Brainerd. Sigrid heard most of it from Reinhard Krogh when she went into town for coffee and lamp oil on the 15th of February. He was no different than he had been before. He told her about the deaths and the losses with the same reluctant relish he had told her in the autumn of 1929 about the talk concerning her hole. She paid him in exact change. "And how did you come through Mrs. Aberg?" he said, sliding her sack of coffee across the counter. "I trust the winter was not too hard on you." She looked at him across the counter. "I came through Mr. Krogh." She walked out without saying more. On On the 16th of March, Halvor Skoglund drove his wagon up her lane and tied his horse at the porch rail and knocked on her kitchen door. He had not been to her kitchen in 11 years. He had stood at her dooryard once in February of 1927 to deliver the food his wife Anna had sent. He had spoken to her at her lane in September of 1929 about the hole. He had nodded to her at the church in Brainerd at Christmas. That had been the entirety of it. He was 71 years old that March morning. His beard had gone fully white. He was wearing a clean wool coat, and he was carrying his hat in his hands. She let him in. She gave him coffee. She sat down across the table from him. He drank some of his coffee. He set the cup down. He looked at the cup for a while. "Your father," he said, "came to my father's farm in the summer of 1889. Sigrid did not move. My father was Erik Skoglund. He had been on the land outside of Stoughton for 11 years by then. He had built his own root cellar by his own design, and he was proud of it. He thought he had done well." Halvor turned his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "Your father came to him in late August of that summer. My father was 42 years old. I was 12. He paused. Torvald Aberg sat at our kitchen table where I sat at my mother's elbow. He was not yet an old man. He was perhaps 50. He had built 3 cellars on his own land by then, the second one better than the first, the third better than the second. He had spent the summer thinking about what he had learned. He came to my father," Halvor said, "to tell him that the cellar my father had built was wrong. Not wrong in its dimensions, wrong in its principles. The walls were not stone-lined deep enough. The floor was not built for thermal mass. The roof would lose heat in any sustained cold below 30 below zero. He had drawn out the corrections on a piece of paper. He had brought the paper with him. Sigrid sat very still. My father, Halvor said, did not take it well. No. He told your father that he had not asked for advice from a man he did not know. He told your father that a Norwegian who had come to America 2 decades after the Skoglunds had no business coming into a Skoglund kitchen and saying what he said. He used the word for. He used the word for old superstition. He called it old peasant superstition, the thinking about the ground holding summer. He called it that to your father's face, in front of my mother, and in front of me. Halvor looked up from his cup. Your father did not raise his voice. He folded the paper. He put it back inside his coat. He thanked my mother for the coffee. He stood up. He said to my father, "You will lose what you do not need to lose. I am sorry to have troubled you." And he walked out of our kitchen. The morning light through Sigrid's kitchen window fell on Halvor's white beard and on the steam rising from his cup. My father lost most of his cellar to a hard cold 3 winters later, Halvor said. He never connected the 2 things. He never let himself. He died in 1903 thinking your father had been a peasant from the old country with peasant ideas. I was 26 that year. I'd begun to wonder by then whether your father had been right. You did not say anything. I did not say anything. To anyone. For another 22 years. Until your father came north in 1925 to see you. I rode out one afternoon while he was here. I stood at the foot of your lane. I meant to go up and to speak to him. I did not. I could not bring myself. He was quiet for a long time. And then he was gone, Halvor said. And then Magnus was gone. And then in September of 1929, I drove past your lane and I saw the mound of subsoil and the stacked creek stone. And I understood the way you understand a thing that has been waiting 40 years for you to understand it. What you were doing back there. beneath the woodshed. He looked at her. Your father had told you, the way he had tried to tell my father in 1889, and you had listened. Sigrid's eyes were wet. She did not raise her hand to them. He left a drawing, she said, in an iron box, buried 4 feet deep where he knew I would dig. I found it in September of 1929, on the 6th day. Halvor closed his eyes. A drawing, he said. Of course he did. He came north in 1925 to bring it. He must have. And to see you, and to see me, yes. Halvor opened his eyes. He took out a handkerchief from the inside pocket of his coat. He pressed it against his eyes briefly and put it back. Sigrid Aberg, he said. His voice had gone rough at the edges. I have come here this morning because I cannot continue without saying it. I am sorry. I am 42 years late. My father was wrong, and I knew it for 30 of those years. And I said nothing. I let your father walk out of our kitchen. I let him die thinking he had been called a name in my house. I have come to ask your forgiveness for the small son of a small man who could not in 1889 see what was being offered him. He set both his hands flat on her kitchen table. Sigrid stood up. She walked around the table. She put her own hand flat on his shoulder, not in the gesture of forgiveness, in the gesture her father had used 56 years ago to read the warmth through a Wisconsin limestone wall. 5 points of contact, the whole palm against the cloth of his coat, reading the way her father had taught her to read. Halvor Skoglund, she said, you are 71 years old. You came to my kitchen this morning by yourself. You said the words. You said them in time. She paused. My father would have heard you. In April, when the ground softened, Halvor Skoglund came back. He brought his oldest son, a quiet, thick-shouldered man of 43, named Olaf. They sat at her kitchen table for most of an afternoon, and they worked through the dimensions and the principles and the materials, and Sigrid brought out the cardstock drawing for the first time and laid it on the oilcloth between them. Halvor looked at her father's hand on the paper for a long time before he spoke. He was a careful man, he said. He was. Olaf and I will build it under the south end of our equipment shed. The ground there is high and the prevailing wind, the same as yours. Yes. Will you come and look at the site? She did. She walked their property with them on the 7th of May. She told them where to dig. She told them how deep. She told them about the 4-hour bonfire, and the burlap-wrapped stones, and the foot of canvas overlap. And Olaf wrote it all down in a small notebook. And Halvor stood at her shoulder with his hat in his hands and listened. The Skoglund pit was finished by the first week of October. It held through the following winter without trouble. It was used for 38 years. Mrs. Vestby's daughter Ada recovered. The fever broke on the 2nd day after the food came. She lived to be 71 years old and had 4 children and 12 grandchildren. And she remembered all her life the morning her mother came home in a sled, driven by the Aberg woman, and the smell of potatoes fried in lard. And she did not learn until she was 43 what her mother had nearly done that night to feed her. Mrs. Vestby came back the next morning as she had been told. She brought a list. Sigrid extended what she had been able to extend. Through the rest of that winter and into the spring, the Vestbys ate from Sigrid's pit on an arrangement of repayment that was never written down and never spoken of in town. By April, Mrs. Vestby was helping Sigrid plant the kitchen garden. By August, they were canning together at Sigrid's kitchen stove. The door that had been closed between them for 19 months did not reopen exactly. It became a different door. It became the door of 2 old women who had each in her own way had to admit something the other had seen, and who had decided in the end that the work of a long winter was too great for pride. Reinhard Krog's gossip about that Aberg woman and her hole quieted by the end of February. It was overtaken in the small, slow, rural way that talk gets overtaken by the talk of who had lost what. A farmer named Muller from up the river road, who had lost 4 milk cows in the cold, came to Sigrid's lane one afternoon in March with his hat in his hands and asked quietly whether he might have a word with her about the storage she had built. She gave him the word. She gave him eventually the dimensions. By the spring of 1932, 4 farms in the township had pits modeled on hers. By 1936, 11. The technique spread by the slow channels of rural knowledge, the way her father had spread it through the Telemark valleys before he left, the way his own father had taught it to him in the 1830s, the way it had been common practice in certain parts of Scandinavia for generations before anyone had thought to write it down. No patent, no diagram in any newspaper, no article anywhere, just the knowledge passed from hands to hands. From a limestone cellar in Wisconsin to a firewood shed in northern Minnesota, through a woman of 64 standing on a cold hillside in September of 1929, with a mattock and a very clear memory of her father's palm pressed against a stone wall. The pit beneath the firewood shed remained in use for 16 more winters. Sigrid improved it twice, once in the autumn of 1932 to extend the stone floor by 2 feet on the east end, adding thermal mass she felt had been lacking in the coldest nights of the Great Cold. Once in 1935 to add a ventilation pipe, a short section of salvaged stovepipe sealed with a damper that allowed controlled air exchange without significant heat loss. The second modification came after a summer when moisture had condensed against the canvas roof and worked into the hay layer, compressing it and reducing its effectiveness. She replaced the hay with packed dry moss from the North Woods that autumn and found it performed even better, tighter, less prone to settling. By the late 1930s, what sat beneath that woodshed was essentially identical in principle, in materials, and in the layered thinking behind it, to what her father had drawn for her on the cardstock in 1925, which had itself been a refinement of what he had built 3 times in Wisconsin, which had itself been a refinement of what his own father had built in Telemark in the 1830s. Sigrid Aberg sold the property in 1948. She was 81 years old. Her knees would not let her keep up with the work any longer. Her niece in Duluth, Magnus's brother's daughter, had a small house and a husband who liked her, and they had room. The couple who bought the farm were young people from a dairy operation in western Wisconsin. He was 26. She was 24. They were optimistic and unprepared in roughly equal measure, which was the condition of nearly everyone who had ever bought a farm in northern Minnesota. And Sigrid did not hold it against them. She did not, when she signed the papers, tell them about the pit. She had thought about it. She had decided against it. She wanted them to find it themselves. They did in their second winter in February of 1950, while reorganizing the firewood. The young husband moved aside the 3rd row of birch from the right, and his boot caught on the leather pull strap of a hatch he had not known was there. And he stopped, and he called his wife, and the 2 of them stood in the woodshed in the late afternoon light and looked at each other for a long moment before he knelt down and lifted the cover. Inside, after 21 years of use and 2 improvements, the chamber was exactly what it had been built to be. Stone walls, sand and stone floor. The low, arched roof of plank and moss and waxed canvas and earth. 8 steps cut into the earth wall. And on the corner stone where Sigrid had set it on the first lowering of stores in the last week of September. 1929, the small iron box. She had left it. She had thought about taking it with her to Duluth. She had decided in the end that the box belonged where it was. The drawing had done its work. The hands that needed it had used it. It belonged now to whoever came next. The young couple wrote to her. They had her address from the sale. They wrote a careful letter on lined paper in the wife's hand. They asked her what the chamber was. They asked her what it was for. They said they had found a small iron box on a corner stone and that they had not opened it yet, and that they wanted to know whether they should. Sigrid wrote back. The letter was 3 paragraphs. She told them what the chamber was briefly in her own words: storage. A cold cellar, built deep enough and with enough thermal mass to hold against any winter Minnesota could put down. She told them how to use it, what to put in it, when to draw down, what to watch for in the canvas. She told them to add fresh moss every 4th autumn. In the 2nd paragraph, she told them about the box. She told them that her father had buried it for her in 1925, and that she had found it on the 6th day of digging in 1929, and that the drawing inside it was the reason any of the rest had worked. She told them they should open it. She told them they should keep it. She told them that if they ever sold the farm, they should leave it where it was, on the corner stone for whoever came after. In the 3rd paragraph, she wrote, "The earth keeps summer longer than we do, months longer. It cools slow, so slow you can borrow it. Once you understand that winter stops being the enemy, you are not fighting the cold. You are borrowing what the ground already has." My father told me that when I was 9 years old. He told me again in his own way when I was 62. I am telling it to you now because someone told it to him once in a country I have never seen, and a thing like that is not meant to stop. She signed it Sigrid Aberg. She mailed it from the small post office on her niece's street in Duluth. The young couple kept the letter for the rest of their lives. They used the pit every winter for 30 years until the property changed hands again in 1980. The couple's daughter, who had grown up helping load it each September and pull from it each January, described it once to a neighbor. When she was 40 and her parents were both gone, and the farm had passed to other people, she said, "It was the most reliable thing on that property, more reliable than the furnace, more reliable than the road, more reliable than the weather forecast. It never let us down, not once." Sigrid Aberg lived in Duluth for 19 more years. She died in the spring of 1967, at the age of 100. Her niece's children, who had grown up around her, said she had been clear in her mind to the end. They said she talked in her last weeks mostly about her father, about a root cellar in Wisconsin, about a hand pressed flat against a limestone wall in October of 1875. She was buried in a small Lutheran cemetery on the east side of Duluth. The headstone read her name and her dates, and beneath them in letters her niece had chosen a single line in Norwegian. Translated, it said, "She kept what she was given." The pit beneath the Firewood shed in northern Minnesota outlasted her. It outlasted eventually the woodshed itself, which fell to weather in the late 1980s and was rebuilt by yet another owner who knew about the chamber by then, because the daughter of the second couple had told him, and who built the new shed carefully over the old hatch and who stocked the pit through the long, deep winter of 1996, when the temperature in his county fell to 42 below zero, and held there for 6 days. His stores came through. The earth kept its summer. The hands had found again what the hands before them had found, and the knowledge moved on quiet, unrecorded from the limestone of Wisconsin to the firewood shed of Minnesota, to wherever it would go next. The way a thing moves that is not meant to stop, the way a palm moves against a stone wall. When a father is teaching a daughter what she will need to know in 55 years, on a January night under a sky so cold, the trees split open in the timber. When she walks out alone with a lantern in her hand and looks at the ground,